Thank you all so much for having me. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this symposium. It's very exciting for me. And as I told them, if I had had something like a postdoctoral fellows association when I had been a postdoc, I think I really would have benefited. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And to everyone who's listening, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited that you would come to a talk about quantitative approaches to social justice. My main message of this talk, I think, is best stated by one of my heroes, Ida B. Wells. And what she said is that the way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them. For me, one form of that light of truth is mathematics, data science, and computation. And so really what this talk about is how I have tried to use those tools in order to shine a light on injustices and to help promote more justice. So the first story I'd like to tell you is about art. And in particular, this story began in 2017. And the piece of background that you need to know is that Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art is the 4th largest art museum in the United States. It's this whole complex of gigantic buildings here. And something else to know about MASSMOCA is that even though people often think it's in Boston, it's not. It's way out here, as far from Boston as you can get and still be in Massachusetts. And in fact, it's near where I live. So in 2017, I moved to Williams College out here in Williamstown, Mass. And MASSMOCA is 10 minutes away in North Adams. And what was going on when I moved is that they had a new wing opening called Building 6. And up in my social media, a friend of mine who's an artist says, did anyone notice that basically all of the artists shown in that new building are white dudes? And I say, oh, I had no idea. Is this typical? Is diversity a problem? My artist friend says, yes, it's very typical. And I say, how bad's the problem? And my friend says, it's bad. And I say, yeah, but like how bad? And my friend doesn't know. And after I ask around for a bit, it turns out that everyone has an anecdotal, a strong anecdotal, and I'll say accurate sense that the world of artists in art museums is not very diverse, but no one knows actually the magnitude of the problem. Now, I will say another great thing I discovered is that people have been trying to bring attention to this issue for a long time. There's this wonderful group, the Guerrilla Girls. They've been around at least since the 70s, pointing out things like 5% of the artists in the modern art section of the Met are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. Here is an article from an influential publication called Art in America. This is from 1990, and the article was called Are Art Museums Racist? Short answer, the article says yes. And there's a poll quote from the article that mentions something about the Dallas Museum of Art, namely that they have instituted progressive programming to confront the reality that museums are almost exclusively devoted to representation of white culture. That sort of thinking was a bit ahead of its time, in my opinion, and I want you to stick a pin in this one about the Dallas Museum of Art. We'll come back to that. What I decided to do, along with some collaborators of mine in data science and in art and art history, is try to investigate empirically the sort of demographic makeup of artists and major US art museums. So we chose 18 major museums who have their catalogs accessible publicly online, and we scraped those catalogs. So we would retrieve artist names and maybe an example of their work and maybe a link to the museum's information about them. And when we scraped that data from those 18 museums, we scraped in the end 187,000-ish artists. And that was too large for our study, so our statisticians randomly sampled them for us, and we ended up with a study set of about 11,500 artists. And our idea was to use crowdsourcing to try to infer their demographic characteristics in that still quite large sample. And if you're not familiar with crowdsourcing, we used a tool called Amazon Mechanical Turk. This is an online crowdsourcing platform called mTurk for short. And there's two sorts of people in this ecosystem. There's people like me who are called requesters. That's on the right side of the slide. And Requesters are people who have tasks to be done called HITs. That stands for Human Intelligence Tasks. These are tasks that are still difficult or impossible to program a computer to do, but humans can do them much more easily. And so the humans who are in this ecosystem waiting to do these hits are called MTurk workers, and the workers can log into the system, see the sort of tasks that are available, they can opt into doing them and earn some money by doing it. Now, there is a very important conversation that has been happening for quite some time about the ethics and labor practices of Amazon Mechanical Turk. That's something we have tried to pay very close attention to, and if you want to ask me about that, you're welcome to. But basically what we did was we took each artist in our study set and we deployed it to MTurk, and we would ask crowd workers to find information about the artist for us. And in particular, we asked for 4 pieces of information. We asked for artist gender, artist race ethnicity, artist national origin, and artist birth year. And it's important to say that especially for those first 2 things, gender and race ethnicity, those are characteristics that are only ever accurately stated by the individual themselves. So really, we don't want to claim that we're measuring gender, race, and ethnicity, but what we are doing is inferring them or measuring society's inference of them. And that inference is important because I think to a large extent, it's how society perceives an individual's demographics that might determine the degree of inclusion or exclusion that that individual experiences. And we didn't just ask 1 crowd worker to study each of our artists. We asked 5 crowd workers because that provided some redundancy, and we would only claim that we could infer a demographic if there was sufficient consensus amongst the 5 crowd workers. Just to show you a quick excerpt of what our survey instrument looked like, we would say, you know, what do you think is the gender of this artist? We'd give some hints for how they might infer it, and there were various choices that they could give us, including non-binary woman and man, and then we would ask each crowd worker, again, to give a confidence rating for the answer that they had just given us. And we would use those confidence ratings in concert with their inference in order to arrive at sort of a total confidence in an inferred demographic. I'll show you some results here. There's a lot I could say about this, but I'll just focus on a couple things. Overall, a mere 12.6% of the artists in our data set were inferred to be women, and a full 85.5% were inferred to be white. So as expected, it's a very white male group. The red highlighted numbers indicate where a statistical test has suggested that the percentage is less diverse than the still rather undiverse overall percentage, and green indicates more diversity. So in other words, here, the Met in New York has approximately 7.3% women artists. That's statistically less women than the 12.6% overall in our study. Similarly, you know, let's see, the Rhode Island School of Design Museum has 78.2% white artists. So that's actually more diverse because it's fewer white people. It's statistically more diverse than the 85.4% overall of white artists in our pool. And the other thing I'll call your attention to here is this 88.7% white artists at Dallas. Dallas was the museum that in 1990 said they were going to institute progressive programming to represent white culture less and other cultures more, and I am not positive that they have succeeded in that endeavor. I also want to say a word about how people have reacted to these results. So people will often say, well, you know, of course these museums are going to be very white and male. You know, they're showing 19th century European art and it was all white dudes making that art. And I guess I have 2 reactions to that. One reaction is that I'm not so sure that that's true. Maybe that's who our histories have recorded as making art, but I'm not sure that other individuals weren't making art as well. But even so, even if we assume it was mostly white men making art, I want to argue that through effort, you can actually have a more diverse collection in your museum. And here's how I'd like to argue that. I'm going to group museums two different ways. On this slide, I'm grouping them by what I call their collection habit demographics. And so this includes a time period, which I'm measuring via average artist birth year, and a geographic region, which I'm measuring by the percentage of a museum's artists that come from different regions. And just for simplicity in the plot, I'm just showing you two of these things. Percentage of museums artists of North American origin on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, I'm showing the average birth year across all of the museum's artists. And we use statistical clustering techniques to group the museums into groups that have similar collection habit demographics, and those groups are color-coded here. On this slide, it's a similar exercise, but I'm using different numbers. I'm using the artist diversity demographics. These are what we were talking about previously. So the percentage of women and percentage of artists from various demographic groups. And for simplicity in the graph, I'm showing you percentage women in the museum on the horizontal axis and percentage white artists on the vertical. And again, we've color-coded to show you museums that have similar demographic profiles according to statistical clustering techniques. And the thing I want you to take away is that these are not related. So on the left, we can, for instance, focus on the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Detroit Institute of Arts. They're very similar. They have an average artist birth year of around 1800. They have, somewhere between 25 and 30% artists of North American origin. And yet, if you look at their artist diversity demographics, they are quite different. So they have similar percentages of women, but Detroit Institute of Arts is a full 15 percentage points more white. And this suggests to me, again, that through some sort of premeditated effort in collections, an artist can, or a museum can come up with a more diverse collection. Here's a quick outcome of this. We were invited to do a data hackathon at the National Gallery of Art, which was one of the museums in our study. And rather than working with data that we had to publicly scrape, we were given their own internal data, which was an amazing opportunity. And here's something that we discovered from it. We discovered that amongst the 14,000 artists in their collection, we estimated 10.5% women, about 2.5% people of color. Now we had access, however, to every one of the 111,000 objects made by those 14,000 artists. And when we sort of slice the data by object, about just under 10% of the objects are made by women and about 4% made by people of color. But then we looked at the objects actually on display at different moments in time. And the thing to know is that a major art museum, about 1 to 2% of the objects are on display at any given time. The rest are in storage. And amongst the displayed objects, at most moments in time, at least prior to 2015, when some changes were made, a scant 2% of those objects were made by women and 1% made by people of color. And what this says is that the low levels of diversity in the collection overall were being exacerbated by the curatorial choices rather than being made better by the curatorial choices. So let me move on to another example now. This is from academia, and this has to do with a scandal in my field of mathematics that was related to diversity statements. So for those of you who are considering applying for academic jobs, you might know that you'll be expected to write a research statement and a teaching statement. That's pretty universal. And what's become increasingly common is that faculty job candidates are asked to write a statement of contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion. That's the background that you need to know. So about a year ago, something happened in the notices of the American Mathematical Society. So the AMS is one of the largest, if not the largest, mathematics associations, and its monthly publication, the notices, is actually the most widespread mathematics publication in the world. And in the December 2019 edition of the notices, one of the society's vice presidents wrote something about what she thought about the use of diversity statements in faculty hiring. And she said that requiring them for job candidates is a mistake reminiscent of events 70 years ago. In 1950, the regents of University of California required all faculty to sign a statement asserting, quote, "I'm not a member of, nor do I support any party or organization that believes in, advocates, or teaches the overthrow of the United States government by force or any illegal or unconstitutional means, and that I am not a member of the Communist Party." So this was, of course, McCarthyism. If you're not familiar with McCarthyism, this is a period in US history in the 1940s and 50s. You've maybe heard the phrase Red Scare. This is the spreading fear of communism. And Senator Joseph McCarthy and many others made baseless accusations of people being communist sympathizers. These people were often relieved of their jobs, sometimes put in prison. People were indeed asked to take loyalty oaths. And this term McCarthyism is now used to mean reckless, unsubstantiated accusations and demagogic character attacks. And so what this AMS vice president was saying is that asking people to write a diversity statement is the same as McCarthyism. I don't happen to agree with that. And there was a strong community response to what she had written. And the community response came in the form of various public letters signed by large numbers of people, also eventually published in the AMS notices. So one group of 586 people signed a letter that basically said, no, that's nuts. Diversity statements are actually quite important, and they in no way equate with McCarthyism. There was another large group of people that said, you know, people who are upset about this essay that was published, stop overreacting. What we really need is just, you know, some civil discussion and debate about whether or not diversity statements are McCarthyism. And then there was a group of people who went a step further. They weighed in explicitly on diversity statements, and they said they're a mistake, and they, quote, diminish mathematical achievement. There was also a group of 73 people who signed both the yellow letter and the red letter. So they said, stop overreacting, and also diversity statements are bad and diminish mathematical achievement. And so what collaborators and I did was we scraped the names of everyone who had signed these public letters that were published online, and we ran them through our crowdsourcing methodology to try to find out things like their gender, their race, ethnicity, their tenure status, and the type of institution that they were located at. You know, was it a research-intensive institution? Was it a teaching institution? Was it something else? So here's what we found, and I'm showing you here just one quick slice of the data. And what I'm showing you is in each letter writing group, what was the percentage of signatories who were the most privileged and empowered, meaning the percentage of signatories who are men, not members of underrepresented ethnic groups, who are tenured and who are situated at highly research-intensive institutions. And amongst the letter signatories who said diversity statements are actually kind of important, it was a scant 5.6% in that group. Amongst the we need discussion and debate crowd, it was a little bit under half were in that sort of most empowered group. In the group that said diversity statements are a mistake and diminish mathematical achievement, it was about 2/3 in that group. And the group of people who said we need discussion and debate and diversity statements are a mistake, they were overwhelmingly men, largely white, practically all tenured and at highly research-intensive institutions. And this was not a surprise to me, as it comports with a lot of theories of power that come from the social sciences. In terms of outcomes from this project, I don't want to say that we were responsible for this outcome, but I do think that we helped through our work and our original letter writing. I think we helped bring some attention to the issue. And so one thing that came out was a high-profile opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal from the chancellor of the institution, where the original essay writer was a faculty member. So this was University of California, Davis. The chancellor and the vice chancellor spoke out very publicly and said, you know, we disagree very strongly with what this essay said. It's inaccurate and illogical and inflammatory and reminiscent of historical attempts to blunt substantive actions aimed at desegregation. And so it was at least something that the university leadership was willing to weigh in on that. Let's turn to criminal justice now. This is a project that has to do with Court Watch. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Court Watch projects, so let me say a few words. These are projects that are focused on trying to bring transparency to what happens in pre-trial hearings. And pre-trial hearings are things like bail hearings, like you've been arrested for some crime and you have to go before the judge, and the judge hears a little bit from the prosecution and the defense about the alleged crime, and then the judge has to make a decision about whether bail is given and whether the defendant is dangerous or not, and so forth. And even though these hearings are in principle public, like you could go sit in a courthouse and just watch them, data about them is not gathered by the judicial system, and it's not made public in any way. And that sort of creates a barrier to knowing what's happening in that stage of our justice process. And so these Court Watch programs have sprung up, and they send volunteers to do the hard work. They literally send volunteers to sit in courtrooms all day, watch all of the pretrial hearings that occur before a judge, and then fill out data sheets about them. And so I had the good fortune to get connected with a Court Watch program in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, where I live. And so this program sent their volunteers in with data sheets. The data sheets would get entered by volunteers into electronic form through a Google form, where we would get the judge name and what courthouse this was in, and the assistant DA's last name, and whether the defendant was released on personal recognizance, that is, with no bail set. And if not, if there were conditions of the release, and if there was bail, how much was the bail, and many, many other questions as well. So the Court Watch program did the sort of data collection and entry work for us, and myself and a student of mine did the analysis. And I'm not going to actually show you all the results now. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about them. But I will say that we took the results and we made them public, and we published a report online. And here is one outcome that happened. On public radio on December 6th of 2019 came out a story that said citizen group collecting data on Berkshire courts releases preliminary report. That was our report. Very nice. And then 5 days later, there's another public radio story. Berkshire DA responds to citizen collected court data. And we were overjoyed that the DA's office actually paid attention to what we had done. And again, it made me want to do this kind of work more. I really started to feel that if you do this kind of work and you make it public, people will take notice. On that note, let's move on to another project. And this one is especially exciting to me because it finally came out in print earlier this week. So it's hot off the presses. And this is a project about sentencing disparities in federal courts. And the background you need to know is that in our federal court system, judges have guidelines on how to sentence defendants that are found guilty. And the guidelines account for the type of crime and for any exacerbating or mitigating factors. So for instance, if you are found guilty of, I don't know, embezzlement, there is a recommended range of prison time for that. And then it can be made longer or shorter, perhaps depending on the amount of money. It can be made longer or shorter, depending on if you were very cooperative with federal authorities or very uncooperative, and so forth. So a judge is required to calculate the guidelines, and they're very, very specific. It's an extremely detailed quantitative algorithm that accounts for hundreds, if not thousands, of different factors. While the judge is required to calculate the suggested sentencing guideline, the judge is not required to use it. The judge can still sentence whatever they want. And so here's a story from 2019 This was when Donald Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, was being sentenced. So for these crimes, the sentencing guidelines recommended between 19 and 24 years, and yet the judge, Judge Ellis, gave a sentence of merely 47 months, and everyone was quite surprised by that, especially the legal scholars. I was surprised and upset, and so I decided I would like to do something about what I view as gross abuse of sentencing guidelines. And so here's a little bit of background about the US federal court system. The court system starts at the lowest level with district courts. These district courts are organized into 13 different circuits. They comprise about 700 judges who have lifetime tenure and see about 350,000 cases per year. Above that, there are circuit courts of appeals, and then of course the Supreme Court. But our study was focused on these district courts. So there is supposed to be transparency in our country in what happens in criminal courts. And in fact, the US public has a constitutional right to observe criminal court proceedings. This was decided in a Supreme Court case in 1980 called Richmond Newspapers versus Virginia. And here's a quotation from the opinion of the plurality. It said, "The First Amendment guarantees of speech and press standing alone prohibit government from summarily closing courtroom doors." So again, in theory, you and I can go and sit in federal district courtrooms, and we could see what defendants are being charged with and what sentencing guidelines are and how the judge actually sentences the defendant. And what you would hope in an ideal world is that the government would just do the job of taking that data and making it transparent and publicly available. But you'll notice that in the title of this slide, I have some question marks. And so here's how it actually works. This building is in Washington, D.C. It's the Thurgood Marshall Federal Judiciary Building, and it contains a lot of the various administrative offices of the federal court system. And on one side of that building is the Federal Judicial Center, and they make available a data set that has demographic information about defendants. It's anonymized, so we don't know who those defendants are, but there's some demographic information about them. On the other side, there's the United States Sentencing Commission, and what they do is they make available detailed, anonymized information about sentences given to defendants for their crimes. These two data sets are not connected, even though they must be connected somewhere inside that building. They are put out separately, and furthermore, neither of them contains information about the sentencing judge. So you can't look at these data sets and both know the demographics of a defendant, the sentence that they were given, and the judge who did it. And what we did is essentially a large data mining project to use publicly available data and to try to match up these bits and pieces and actually be able to say, here was a crime, here was a defendant, here was the judge who gave a sentence, and here's what the sentence was. And we call this project JUSTFAIR, which stands for Judicial System Transparency through Federal Archive Inferred Records. And I'm just showing you an example of the kind of information that we can get out of this database. This example is the Honorable David Gregory Kays from the Western District of Missouri. This judge was a George W. Bush appointee. If you Google him in the news, you'll find some sort of high-profile stories about him, dismissing a suit about excessive police force. You'll find a high-profile story about him siding with meat packing companies rather than workers who had safety concerns during the COVID pandemic. But what I'm showing you here is his overall record on criminal sentences. And I've divided things up by white defendants and defendants who are minoritized along by their race or ethnicity. And I'm showing you the percentage of time that a judge gave below range, within range, or above range sentences to that group. So that is to say, the percentage of time that this judge gave white defendants a sentence more lenient than what was recommended by the guidelines was 29%. The judge gave within the recommended range 59% of the time, and a harsher sentence to white defendants 12% of the time. On the other hand, for minoritized defendants, they got more lenient sentences, only about at half the rate that white defendants did, and they got more harsh sentences approaching double the rate that white defendants did. And so this one is sort of a chin scratcher, and we are in the midst of a second project that, now that we have sort of compiled this data, we're in the midst of using a bunch of statistical modeling and analysis techniques to really delve into it and see if we can detect convincing evidence of racial bias in judges. I'm going to quickly flash through for you a few other projects that are in progress. This one has to do with equity and bias in professional orchestra auditions. This is because my other life, I'm sort of a semi-professional violist. And so this is an orchestra. An orchestra is made up of different sections, of different instruments, and each section has a section leader. Something you might not know is that the leader and the section players have different audition procedures. So when the section players audition for the panel of judges, who's going to choose who gets the seat, they do it with a screen. So the judges can't actually see who's playing and know if it's a woman or a man or a non-binary individual and what their race or ethnicity is. On the other hand, principal players are unscreened. And so the judges will be able to infer things about that individual's demographics. And we would like to ask the question of whether demographic patterns differ for section and principal players. And so we started with a set of 53 orchestras. We statistically clustered them based on some characteristics of those orchestras: their annual budget, the number of weeks of concerts that they play, the total number of concerts that they play, and so forth. We chose sort of the two higher tier clusters within that group, which amounts to 25 orchestras, and we've written some code to scrape those players and their instruments and whether or not they are a principal player from the websites of the orchestras. And we will be crowdsourcing to infer their gender and ethnicity, which will allow us to address this question of whether there's a difference in demographic pattern. Here's a current project that has to do with healthcare, and in particular pharmacies. So here's a Washington Post story from last year that's describing a woman who had a condom mishap and who needed emergency contraception. And when she got to the pharmacy to pick up her prescription that her doctor had prescribed, the pharmacist wouldn't give it to her. He said he wouldn't sell her the emergency birth control pill because of his own personal religious objection. And so this begs the question, can pharmacists refuse to fill prescriptions based on personal belief? In a handful of states, the answer is no. State legislation explicitly forbids it. In some states, the answer is yes, but the pharmacist is required to try to help them fill it somewhere else. In some states, the answer is just a flat out yes. The pharmacist can just say, I'm not going to fill your prescription and I'm sending you on your way. And then in 29 other states, the law is super unclear. No one knows what prescriptions might potentially be involved. I mean, we have this anecdotal evidence that it could involve contraception, the morning after pill, drugs that are meant to induce labor or abortion when there's a problem with the pregnancy, perhaps drugs for HIV treatment or pre-exposure prophylactics, perhaps hormones for transgender individuals, and who knows what else. We don't know because there's no systematic and widespread data on it. So we are in the middle of trying to design and launch a crowdsourcing effort that will do two things. It will amass in an ethical way a data set that we will be able to do research on to answer some of these questions about when this happens, who it happens to, why it happens. It will also hopefully result in a publicly available tool that, for lack of a better word, I'm thinking of something as like Yelp for pharmacies. There will be some public information about these are pharmacies where individuals have experienced a lot of prescription refusals, and these are pharmacies where they have not. Let me end by saying that about a year and a half ago, I started an institute. I co-founded the Institute for the Quantitative Study of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity, QSIDE. This is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And so a lot of the projects that I've told you about, the finished ones and the ongoing ones, have all happened under the QSIDE umbrella. Other projects that I didn't even mention to you yet include looking at gender representation on editorial boards of research journals. We have a sort of theoretical project that has to do with diversity and identity confirmation. We're working on using Markov chains to do predictive models of college admissions, demographics, and affirmative action. We are looking at diversity and persistence in STEM majors in higher education, and sort of disparate impacts that introductory STEM courses might have. We are involved in a widespread inventory of diversity and popular culture in the US. So that's the arts, popular film, pop music, and fashion. We have a current project that has to do with who was let out of jail in the New York City jail system during the COVID pandemic, and a bunch of other things as well. So I will end by saying that if you are interested in getting involved in QSIDE, there are a lot of ways to do it. You can visit our website, you can follow us on social media, you can join our affiliate program for free. You can encourage your institution or department to join our consortium, which provides a bunch of benefits. We exist on donations. We're a nonprofit that's largely funded by people's goodwill. So if you feel like supporting the organization, please do that. Regardless, you can watch our colloquium series online that has wonderful speakers talking about social justice issues and their intersection with quantitative approaches, but in very non-technical talks. You can watch those online. And if you're interested in collaborating with us, you can get in touch and let us know. That's the end, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Topaz. It was a really interesting presentation, both in terms of content, in terms of methods, and I'll have to share, I'm in the middle of faculty job application, so I just learned from you by the way of presenting information to a new audience. So thank you very much. And I will turn now to Ray, who will be taking questions from the audience, and I see we already have a couple of questions.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Dr. Topaz, for that wonderful talk. I'll start out with this question from the audience. Are there similar studies done in other parts of the world that you could compare your results to, say for art museums, criminal justice systems in other parts of the world? How do they compare to the United States?
That's a wonderful question. So I'll try to speak to those two things individually and then the bigger picture. For art museums, I'm pretty sure the answer is no. So people have looked at various ways that diversity impacts the world of art museums. The Mellon Foundation here in the States has done like a pretty large study of museum staff diversity, but in terms of examining the catalogs, the actual art in the museums on like a large scale, our study is the only one that I know of, or at least at the time we did it, it was. As for the criminal justice stuff, I'm less well informed on that. What I can say is that at least in the States, the main reason that this hadn't been done before is that actually, so I should step back. This field of legal research on sentencing disparities is like a huge field. Like, we did not make this up. Legal scholars have been thinking about sentencing disparities for a long time. And in terms of the role that judges play, what people have been able to investigate has to do with what factors of judges might result in sentencing disparities. And when I say what factors of judges, I mean things like whether the judge was appointed by a Republican or a Democratic president, and like who the judge is impaneled with, and possibly even their race and their gender and race ethnicity. But what that research hadn't been able to do was identify the individual judges, because even though the researchers needed individual judge level information to answer it, the way they were getting that information was from proprietary sources who had put it together, and the proprietary sources explicitly forbid unmasking judge identities. So, I mean, this whole thing about like wanting to have information about individual judges, that arose because of the way data has been distributed and hidden in the States. I'm just less familiar with what it is in other countries. But I will say also that even just talking about race, ethnicity the way we do is very specific. I mean, it's a complicated enough conversation in the US, right? But when you want to have that conversation worldwide, you're thinking about countries that have completely different histories and different definitions of like what race and ethnicity are, and the sort of really rough coarse categorizations that we use here like don't even apply in other places. So I do think it's like a really worthwhile question, and I also think it's like really hard to compare. Yeah,
absolutely. It's yeah. All right, the next question is from Jacob Bennett. He says, thanks so much for your work. I wonder, while the work you're doing quantitatively is extremely important and great to pull attention to matters of diversity and inclusion, how do you see qualitative work playing a role in ameliorating or improving inequality?
Oh, I mean, yeah, absolutely, right? So I think the kind of work that I've discussed today is like a complementary lens, and absolutely all of these approaches to the problem are critical. I mean, so, and I think they're critical for a number of reasons. Like, one is, I think there's a certain sense in which empirical data can influence a conversation, but I also think there's a certain sense in which we know that like qualitative research and narrative are like play a really crucial role. And so I think just in terms of like, I think quantitative data can be like a useful thing for shining a light, right? It helps us know how big the problems are and where they're happening. But I think that it's that sort of qualitative research provides critical information on how we might like specifically address and understand the root causes of some of these problems. But I don't know, for whoever asked this question, I don't know if they're able to respond, but I'm super interested what they have to say as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's a way for an audience to talk to you directly.
Quite all right.
But
quite all right.
You know, we do have a Gather platform for interaction later on. If you're not too busy later in the day when we have the social gathering, you're more than welcome to attend, perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The next question actually comes from myself, if you don't mind. But I've noticed from your presentation that you work on various aspects and various social justice issues, and I'm wondering, how do you say prioritize or choose the topics to work on? I know some may be personally driven, others may be like a graduate student of yours has something they're personally invested in. And I wonder, with so little time that you might have and so many issues to work on, like how do you go about with your research?
It's a great question, and I believe in always being honest, and I'm going to give you the most honest answer I can. In terms of prioritization, at this stage, I literally have no prioritization. And it turns out that like starting an institute is like really exciting and also like hard. And so the rule I have been following is that like any potential project that arises is a project I work on. And so like that's literally how it works right now. But the way that I've been trying to make that work is like part of what QSIDE is this like broad coalition of collaborators, right? So I work with amazing, smart, skilled, talented people. So it is certainly like not like I'm doing this alone by any stretch. So far, we have not said no to putting a project under the QSIDE umbrella because we feel like it's always important stuff. In terms of like how I think of the ideas come to QSIDE in like one of two ways. And the first way is that like, which is probably responsible for more of the projects to date, is that there's stuff that we, the co-founders, like think of. And if you're wondering like, how do I get my ideas? Again, the honest answer is like, it's stuff I get mad about. It's like, I look in the world or I read things or I watch the news and I get pissed off and then I decide I should try to do something about it. So this is my way of trying to do something about things. The other way that things come to us is external folks will like contact us and be like, hey, like I heard of the Institute and what you all are doing. You know, I'm sort of like curious about this project. So like just as a for example, there's another project that I didn't even mention today, but it's also related to classical music. And a person who runs a piano performance institute came to us and wanted to understand why it is that even though most piano students are women, like women have a gender majority at the student level, that like most professional piano soloists are men, like men have a clear demographic majority at that level. And so that's a project that some QSIDE folks have been working on, and that's one where someone just came to us with a great question. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Next question is from Inga. She asked, what is the most common statistical method that you use, or what is your favorite method? And how do you choose which one is the right one to use?
Okay, that's a great question. So again, honesty. So my training is not as a statistician. That doesn't mean I don't know any statistics, but my training is very much like in applied mathematics. So like I was trained in like differential equations and mathematical modeling and numerical computation. And I do use those tools in QSIDE work as well. But yes, it is a lot of very statistics-y, data science-y stuff too. And I would say like, I mean, this is the funny thing, is sometimes straightforward tools are really all you need to answer an interesting question, right? So I'm never one for using fancy stuff just for the heck of it. So I would say like in terms of data science tools that we use, I don't know what you count as falling under that umbrella, or if you want more specifically like statistical things, but we do a lot of data scraping. We do a lot of data cleaning. We do a lot of data clustering. We do a lot of testing for differences between groups, right? It's all this kind of thing. We do this like Markov chain modeling kind of stuff. That's another thing that we do. Certainly a lot of like parameter inference and curve fitting, like that sort of business. So it's like a smorgasbord of tools. You know, I'm lucky to work with people who know way more statistics than I do, and they keep us honest, and that's what we do.
Awesome. Let's see. Next question. Person asks, how do you recommend researchers and others folks to use, interpret, and share resources like the JUSTFAIR dataset? I guess like if you don't have the background in data science and analytics, is it something that we could still have access to for, I guess, for referencing and conversations?
Sure. Yeah. So let me try to address that in a couple of ways. So we have on our QSIDE website like a sort of more detailed mission statement, and there's 4 pillars of our mission. And one is to like build capacity for the kind of work that we do. And that means like doing stuff to like bring these populations of like quantitative nerds like me and like people with real expertise in the areas that touch on social justice and who have deep training in like the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences, to like bring these audiences closer together and get them to interact. So that's one thing we do. The second thing we do is we do these research projects. The third thing we do is like what we think of as data transparency. So we are big believers in that. Let me say it a different way. I think we have developed a specialty in data that is in principle public, but is in practice not public. And so what we do is we amass these data sets and we make them all public. So if you go to the QSIDE website, you'll be able to find, if you delve into there enough, our various data sets. And what we're in the process of doing is, even for people who don't want to work with a data set directly, we're working on putting visualizers on top of them all. So for instance, the main one that we have completed so far is for the JUSTFAIR project, the Federal Judges Project. So if you go to QSIDE.org/JUSTFAIR, then you will get to a page where you can click on the visualizer. It's built in a tool called Tableau, but it's just for the public to interact with the data. And you can be like, oh, I live in Arkansas. I want to like look up judges in Arkansas and see like how they're behaving with regards to federal sentencing guidelines. So yeah, it's like short answer, after a long answer I just gave. It's a core part of our mission to make information available to anyone who wants it, whether it's at a detailed level or just a sort of like visual interaction level. Yeah.
No, that's great. It's like, you know, we're surrounded by data, but sometimes it's hard to see all the data in one place. So I think it's really important to have that sort of transparency and visualization tools to make that happen.
Thanks, Ray. And actually, can I add one quick thing?
Sure.
Because I think maybe the question also touched on like skills to study the data. And I mean, I cannot emphasize this enough. Like, I don't know who the particular audience of people is here today. I don't know what your quantitative training is. Honestly, I don't care, because there's not a single person who is a postdoctoral fellow in any field who is not capable of learning the tools you need to analyze this data. And like, I don't know if you've seen the movie like Ratatouille. I have an 11-year-old daughter, so like we watch a lot of animated, or at least we used to watch a lot of animated films. It's a movie where like there's this animated mouse who loves cooking, and he's sort of like inspired by this chef who said anyone can cook. And this is like very much my philosophy about like math and data science. Anyone can do it. Like, it takes some practice, and there are tons of free online data schools that you can go to learn how to do this stuff. So like, if you're out there listening to this and you feel inspired, like, wow, it would be cool to work on this, but like, I don't know any statistics or whatever, I promise you, you can do it.
Yeah, my girlfriend is also taking some data chem courses. So yeah, absolutely. Anyone, I'm not saying my girlfriend can't do it, but yeah, anyone can do it and learn data science and everything. Yeah.
Yes.
I think we only have time for one more question, unfortunately. So here's another question. So before you started working on social justice, you were working on locust research, supposedly. How was that? How did you make that pivot? What was that pivot like? Were there challenges?
Oh, yeah. Okay, great question. So more broadly speaking, before my life in social justice and data science, I worked on pattern formation in the natural sciences. So all sorts of systems that form patterns. So insect swarms and fish schools and sort of like collective motion in biology. That was one sort of thing I worked on. I work on chemical patterns and chemical reaction diffusion systems. I've worked on like patterns in fluid waves and fluid physics and that sort of stuff. And it was a big pivot. And I think the reason I made the pivot was because, like, I don't know, this started maybe 5 years ago, and I'm 46 now. So I guess I was 41 and like bluntly like having a midlife crisis, and like bluntly like feeling probably like a little bored of having done all the same stuff that I had always been doing. And I like teamed up with a friend of mine in my department at the time, and we decided to do like a Coursera sequence on data science together. So it's like 9 courses from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, this data science sequence that earned us a certificate, and we were like study buddies. And then I was like, I want to do something like, now that I know a tiny bit of data science. And I have always been like politically active and really interested in politics and current events and human rights and all these sort of social justice. And so I was just like, okay, it's time for me to see if I can like mash these things up somehow. Yeah, it was a long, if I really look at it, it was a long journey.
Well, fortunately, that might be the only time left for questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Maria for her announcements. Thank you so much again, Dr. Topaz, for your wonderful talk and your wonderful Q&A.
Thanks for the questions, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you very much again, Dr. Topaz, and thank you to all of the audience for attending today. I just wanted to say that typically for a Vanderbilt Postdoctoral Symposium, the speaker gets an honorarium, but Dr. Topaz decided not to get the honorarium, but would ask that the honorarium amount is donated to organizations serving here in Nashville. So with the VPA board, we decided that they will be donated to 2 groups, the Equity Alliance and the Gideon's Army. So just wanted to let you know that this amazing work has been done, and thank you to organizers for this. And without this talk, this wouldn't happen. So thank you, Dr. Topaz. And just on the final note, so again, thank you all to attending. At 1:30, we have a Bread Career Advising, 2 o'clock a science advocacy discussion, 3:15 lightning talks, and 4:30 networking. So we hope you join. Please refer to the program or contact any of us. Again, thank you, Dr. Topaz.